The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 16b. The President's First Message to Congress. Gathering of Troops in Washington. Reviews and Parades. Disaster at Bull Run. The President visits the Army. Good advice to an angry officer. A peculiar Cabinet meeting. Dark days for Lincoln. A black mood in the White House. As Mr. Markland, a prominent Kentuckian, relates in his reminiscences of the period, immediately a campaign for the Union was begun in Kentucky. The State could not be dragooned into open secession. Therefore the neutrality policy was adopted. That policy was more rigidly observed by Mr. Lincoln than it was by his opponents, but he was not misled by it. Judge Joseph Holt made eloquent appeals for the Union through the columns of the press and from the forum, as did the Speeds, the Goodloes, and many others of prominence. Rousseau, Jacobs, Poundbaker, and others stood guard in the Legislature, and by their eloquence stayed the tide of disunion there. The labors of Judge Holt, the Speeds, the Goodloes, Cassius M. Clay, and their followers had brought forth fruit for the Union. The patriotic men in the Legislature had done their work well. The men in the camps on the north side of the Ohio River moved over into Kentucky, and the invasion of Confederates which was to sweep Kentucky into secession was at an end. Kentucky was saved to the Union by the wise counsel and pacific policy of Abraham Lincoln. A special session of Congress convened on the 4th of July in obedience to the summons of the President in his proclamation of April 15th. The following day the message of the Executive rehearsed to the joint houses the circumstances which had rendered their assembling necessary. It portrayed in clear and succinct words the situation of affairs, the aggressive acts of the States aiming to disrupt the Federal Union, and the measures adopted by the administration to frustrate their attempts. The assailants of the Government, said the President, have forced upon the country the distinct issue, immediate dissolution or blood. And this issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, too few in numbers to control administration according to organic law in any case, can always, upon the pretenses made in this case, or on any other pretenses, or arbitrarily without any pretense, break up their government, and thus practically put an end to free government upon the earth. It forces us to ask, is there, in all republics, this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government, of necessity, be too strong for the liberties of its own people, or too weak to maintain its own existence? The message requested of Congress the legal means for making this contest a short and decisive one: that you place at the control of the Government, for the work, at least 400,000 men and $400,000,000. That number of men is about 1/10 of those of proper ages within the regions where, apparently, all are willing to engage, and the sum is less than a 23rd part of the money value owned by the men who seem ready to devote the whole. A debt of $600,000,000 now is a less sum per head than was the debt of our Revolution when we came out of that struggle, and the money value in the country now bears even a greater proportion to what it was then than does the population. Surely each man has as strong a motive now to preserve our liberties as each had then to establish them. The message dwelt upon the encouraging facts that the free institutions which we enjoy have developed the powers and improved the condition of our whole people beyond any example in the world. Of this we now have a striking and an impressive illustration. So large an army as the Government has now on foot was never before known without a soldier in it, but had taken his place there of his own free choice. But more than this, there are many single regiments whose members, one and another, possess full practical knowledge of all the arts, sciences, professions, and whatever else, whether useful or elegant, is known in the world, and there is scarcely one from which there could not be selected a President, a Cabinet, a Congress, and perhaps a Court, abundantly competent to administer the government itself. Finally, and eloquently, the message demonstrated the significance of the war in its effect upon the liberties and prayers of all mankind. This message again illustrates Lincoln's singular power of stating clearly and convincingly the nature and exigencies of the struggle for the preservation of the Union. Said he, "This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuits for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. Yielding to partial and temporary departures from necessity, this is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. I am most happy to believe that the plain people understand and appreciate this. It is worthy of note that while in this the government's hour of trial, large numbers of those in the army and navy who have been favored with the offices have resigned and proved false to the hand which had pampered them, not one common soldier or common sailor is known to have deserted his flag. Great honor is due to those officers who remained true despite the example of their treacherous associates. But the greatest honor, and most important fact of all, is the unanimous firmness of the common soldiers and common sailors. To the last man, so far as known, they have successfully resisted the traitorous efforts of those whose commands but an hour before they obeyed as absolute law. This is the patriotic instinct of plain people. They understand, without an argument, that destroying the government which was made by Washington means no good to them. Our popular government has often been called an experiment. 2 points in it our people have already settled: the successful establishing and the successful administering of it. One still remains: its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. It is now for them to demonstrate to the world that those who can fairly carry an election can also suppress a rebellion; that ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets; and that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no successful appeal back to bullets; that there can be no successful appeal except to ballots themselves, at succeeding elections. Such will be a great lesson of peace, teaching men that what they cannot take by an election, neither can they take by a war; teaching all the folly of being the beginners of a war. Through the early summer of 1861, Washington was alive with preparations for a military movement against the enemy in Virginia. Troops from the North were constantly arriving, and as rapidly as possible were assigned to different organizations and drilled in the art of war. Few comparatively know or can appreciate the actual condition of things and the state of feeling of the members of the administration in those days, says Secretary Welles. Nearly 60 years of peace had unfitted us for any war. But the most terrible of all wars, a civil war, was upon us, and it had to be met. Congress had adjourned without making any provision for the storm, though aware it was at hand and soon to burst upon the country. A new administration, its members scarcely acquainted with each other, and differing essentially in the past, was compelled to act promptly and decisively. The burden upon the President began to grow tremendous, but he did not shrink or falter. Upon his back a more than Atlas load, the burden of the Commonwealth was laid. He stooped and rose up to it, though the road shot suddenly downwards, not a whit dismayed. He labored incessantly in urging forward the preparations for the great struggle which, however he might regret it, he now saw was inevitable. He was in daily conference with the officers of the army and of the War Department, and was present at innumerable reviews and parades of the soldiers. The 4th of July was memorable for a grand review of all the New York troops in and about the city. It was a brilliant and impressive scene. Says a spectator, Hon. A.G. Riddle, "As they swept past, 25,000 boys in blue, their muskets flashing, bands playing, and banners waving, I stood near a distinguished group surrounding the President, and noted his countenance as he turned to the massive moving column. All about him were excited, confident, exultant. He stood silent, pale, profoundly sad, as though his prophetic soul saw what was to follow. He seemed to be gazing beyond the splendid pageant before him upon things hidden from other eyes. Was there presaged to him a vision of that grander view of our victorious armies at the close of the war, which he was not to see?" A few days later, all the troops in Washington crossed the Long Bridge and marched, gallant and exultant, straight toward the enemy in Virginia. The advance of our army resulted on the 21st of July in the shameful disaster at Bull Run. The North was filled with surprise and dismay, and even the stoutest hearts were burdened with anxiety for the future. Lincoln at first shared somewhat in the general depression, but his elastic spirits quickly rallied him from the shock. 3 or 4 days after the battle, some gentlemen who had been on the field called upon him. He inquired very minutely regarding all the circumstances of the affair, and after listening with the utmost attention, said with a touch of humor, "So it's your notion that we whipped the rebels and then ran away from them?" Not long after this, the President made a personal visit to the army in Virginia. General Sherman, at that time connected with the Army of the Potomac, says, "I was near the river bank, looking at a block house which had been built for the defense of the aqueduct, when I saw a carriage coming by the road that crossed the Potomac River at Georgetown by a ferry. I thought I recognized in the carriage the person of President Lincoln. I hurried across a bend, so as to stand by the roadside as the carriage passed. I was in uniform, with a sword on, and was recognized by Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Seward, who rode side by side in an open hack. I inquired if they were going to my camp, and Mr. Lincoln said, 'Yes, we heard that you had got over the big scare, and we thought we would come over and see the boys.' The roads had been much changed and were rough. I asked if I might give directions to his coachman. He promptly invited me to jump in and to tell the coachman which way to drive. Intending to begin on the right and follow round to the left, I turned the driver into a side road which led up a very steep hill, and, seeing a soldier, called to him and sent him up hurriedly to announce to the colonel whose camp we were approaching that the President was coming. As we slowly ascended the hill, I discovered that Mr. Lincoln was full of feeling, and wanted to encourage our men. I asked if he intended to speak to them, and he said he would like to. I asked him then to please discourage all cheering, noise, or any sort of confusion, that we had had enough of it before Bull Run to ruin any set of men, and that what we needed were cool, thoughtful, hard-fighting soldiers, no more hurrahing, no more humbug. He took my remarks in the most perfect good nature. Before we had reached the first camp, I heard the drum beating the assembly, saw the men running for their tents, and in a few minutes the regiment was in line, arms presented, and then brought to an order and parade rest. Mr. Lincoln stood up in the carriage and made one of the neatest, best, and most feeling addresses I ever listened to, referring to our late disaster at Bull Run, the high duties that still devolved on us, and the brighter days yet to come. At 1 or 2 points the soldiers began to cheer, but he promptly checked them, saying, "Don't cheer, boys. I confess I rather like it myself, but Colonel Sherman here says that it is not military, and I guess we had better defer to his opinion." In winding up, he explained that as President he was commander-in-chief, that he was resolved that the soldiers should have everything that the law allowed, and he called on one and all to appeal to him personally in case they were wronged. The effect of this speech was excellent. We passed along in the same manner to all the camps of my brigade, and Mr. Lincoln complimented me highly for the order, cleanliness, and discipline that he observed. Indeed, he and Mr. Seward both assured me that it was the first bright moment that they had experienced since the battle. "In the crowd at Fort Corcoran," continues General Sherman, "I saw an officer with whom I had had a little difficulty that morning. His face was pale and his lips were compressed. I foresaw a scene, but sat on the front seat of the carriage as quiet as a lamb. This officer forced his way through the crowd to the carriage, and said, 'Mr. President, I have a cause for grievance. This morning I went to speak to Colonel Sherman, and he threatened to shoot me.' Mr. Lincoln, who was still standing, said, 'Threatened to shoot you?' 'Yes, sir, he threatened to shoot me.' Mr. Lincoln looked at him, then at me, and, stooping his tall, spare form toward the soldier, said to him in a loud stage whisper, easily heard for some yards around, 'Well, if I were you, and he threatened to shoot, I would not trust him, for I believe he would do it.' The officer turned about and disappeared, and the men laughed at him. Soon the carriage drove on, and as we descended the hill I explained the facts to the President, who answered, 'Of course I didn't know anything about it, but I thought you knew your own business best.' I thanked him for his confidence, and assured him that what he had done would go far to enable me to maintain good discipline, and it did." The days following the Bull Run disaster were full of depression and discouragement, but Lincoln bore up bravely. He began to feel the terrible realities of his position, and saw himself brought face to face with the most awful responsibilities that ever rested upon human shoulders. A disrupted Union, the downfall of the great American Republic, so long predicted by envious critics of our institutions, seemed about to be accomplished. At the best, the Union could be saved only by the shedding of seas of priceless blood and the expenditure of untold treasures. And he must act, control, choose, and direct the measures of the government and the movements of its vast armies. And what if all should fail? What if the resources of the government should prove inadequate, and its enemies too powerful to be subdued by force? No wonder he was appalled and well nigh overwhelmed by the dark prospect before him. Rev. Robert Collyer tells of seeing Lincoln in the summer of 1861 on the steps of the White House. Answering very simply and kindly to the marks of respect some soldiers had come to pay him, who stood in deep ranks on the grass that had been top-dressed with compost enough to cover the whole District of Columbia, as the chairman of the committee that had to pass the account told me. And once, curiously, I saw only his feet. It was soon after the battle of Bull Run, when some say that we ran, and some say that they ran, and all was quiet on the Potomac, but the nation was stamping and champing the bit. And passing the White House one day, I saw 3 pairs of feet on the sill of an open window, and pausing for a moment, a good-natured fellow said, 'That's the Cabinet a-sittin', and them big feet's old Abe's.' So lecturing in Boston not long after, I said, like a fool as I was, 'That's about all they are good for in Washington, to point their feet out of window and talk, but go nowhere and do nothing,' when indeed the good President's heart was even then breaking with anxiety and trouble. "One day," says Mr. A.G. Riddle, "I called at the White House to present a distinguished stranger who had important matters to bring to Mr. Lincoln's notice. It was evening, cold, rainy, and cheerless. The Executive Mansion was gloomy and silent. At Mr. Lincoln's door we were told by the attendant to enter. We found the room quite dark and seemingly vacant. I advanced a step or two to determine if any one were present, and was arrested by a strange apparition, at first not distinguishable. The long, seemingly lifeless limbs of a man, as if thrown upon a chair and left to sprawl in unseemly disorder. A step further, and the fallen head disclosed the features of the President. I turned back. A word from my companion reached the drooping figure, and a sepulchral voice bade us advance. We came upon a man in some respects the most remarkable of any time in the hour of his prostration and weakness, in the depths of that depression to which his inherited melancholy at times reduced him, now perhaps coming to overwhelm him as he thought of the calamities of his country.